Hey everybody, I'm reading, this video is from a recording of part 1 of the theory of the permanent revolution, the part 1 of Baruch Knei-Paz's The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky. Part 1 is titled The Theory of the Permanent Revolution. I'm going to be reading this bit in sections probably, just so I don't have any 4-hour long videos, which are no one likes, and I don't particularly like listening to them myself when I listen to my own readings. So yeah, here we go. I might read this whole chapter because I believe this chapter is short, but I'll decide. I don't know how I'm going to organize this, so however it goes up on this YouTube, this is how it goes up on YouTube. Chapter 1, Minds and Reality, Ideas and Revolution. Quote, all through history, mind limps after reality, end quote. Trotsky, Literature and Revolution. Nothing is more characteristic of the young Trotsky, as indeed of the familiar figure who was to emerge in later years, than his independence of mind and disdain for authority. By Trotsky's own account, which is corroborated by all we know about him from other sources as well, he was by nature suspicious of all received opinion. In his autobiography he describes, not without a measure of self-delight, this ingrained skepticism, which often took the form of an almost exhibitionistic rebelliousness against parents, teachers, and schoolmates. Footnote. C1, pages 17 to 126 for a description. From Moyazin, 2 volumes, Berlin, 1980, C1, pages 17 to 126 for Trotsky's description of his childhood and early youth. The English translation of this autobiography was published in 1930 under the title My Life, reissued in New York in 1960. The most complete biography of Trotsky is, of course, Isaac Deutscher's 3-volume account, The Prophet Armed, The Prophet Unarmed, The Prophet Outcast, published respectively in 1954, 1959, and 1963. Max Eastman's Leon Trotsky, The Portrait of Youth, published in New York in 1926, is a somewhat adulatory account of Trotsky's childhood and youth, but has the advantage of being based on interviews with the subject. G.A. Zeev, Trotsky, Charakteristika po lichnym Vospominianum, consists of reminiscences by a friend from youth who, however, later became a political opponent. The sections devoted to Trotsky and Bertram D. Wolf's The Three Who Made a Revolution, published in Boston in 1955, are based almost entirely on Trotsky's autobiography and on Eastman and Ziv. There is also a somewhat forced psychoanalytical account in E. Victor Wolfenstein's The Revolutionary Personality, Lenin, Trotsky, Gandhi. See also Edmund Wilson, To the Finland Station, published in 1960. A recent attempt at a biography is Joel Carmichael, Trotsky, An Appreciation of His Life, published in 1975. End footnote. Trotsky had little patience with conventions, none at all with religious belief, and he was unable to comprehend how people could behave in ways contrary to the dictates of reason. Trotsky was also, however, even at an early age, somewhat flamboyant, attracted by a move to the side with the colorful, the extravagant, even the ostentatious. In short, all that which could be proclaimed and done with flair and enthusiasm, of which qualities he had in abundance. Together with this temperament, there emerged, almost from the outset, a seemingly compulsive inclination towards the world of ideas and of intellectual preoccupations in general, though there was not much in the immediate environment of his youth to encourage it. Born on the 26th of October 1879 in the remote village of Yanovka in the Kherson province of southern Ukraine, quote, a kingdom of wheat and sheep, living by laws all its own, firmly guarded against the invasion of politics by its great open spaces and the absence of roads, end quote. Trotsky, Lev Davidovich Bronstein, as he was at birth, and until 1902, was the son of a well-to-do and hard-working but virtually illiterate Jewish farm owner who spoke an amalgam of Russian and Ukrainian, mostly Ukrainian. There's a footnote here. About the coinciding, as it turned out, of this day and month with that of the Russian Revolution 38 years later, Trotsky would only comment that, quote, mystics and Pythagoreans may draw from this whatever conclusions they like, end quote. End footnote. The mother, in contrast, was literate with some education and of an urban background, but one has the impression from Trotsky's own description of her, a woman of limited depth. There could have been little in the home itself to satisfy Trotsky's native curiosity. Each passing day in life in general was dominated by the, quote, rhythm of the toil on the farm, end quote. End quote, nothing mattered except the price of grain on the world market, end quote. Aside from a few months spent studying at a Jewish religious school in a nearby village, Trotsky hardly stepped outside Yanovka during the first 9 years of his life. In 1888, however, he was sent off to a Vilshula in Odessa, where Trotsky remained nearly 7 years and where he was introduced to the opera and theater and most of all to books. For the latter, he developed a boundless enthusiasm. His reading and his interests were at this time confined mainly to imaginative literature. Trotsky became fascinated with the world of letters and clearly yearned to enter it one day. Politics as such hardly impinged upon his consciousness at first, but being sensitive and observant, Trotsky was growing more aware of the social character of his environment and developing a sense of its problems and iniquities. Moreover, at school, Trotsky often found himself in disciplinary difficulties as a result of his rebellious nature, his propensity for the dramatic confrontation over issues in dispute, and his aggressive, self-confident intellectual nonconformism. All these characteristics, in fact, seemed to be at play in his initial hostile encounter with Marxist ideas. When, at the age of 16 or so, he began to take an interest in political questions, Trotsky was more easily drawn to populism at first, not, it seems, out of any deep identification with populism's ideas, but on the contrary, because populism allowed him to give vent to his contumacy and to his need for the demonstrative, without being constrained by any rigid doctrinal commitments. Marxism, on the other hand, whose general tenets he had vaguely become acquainted with, quite clearly repelled him at the outset. In his autobiography, he tells why this is so. In 1896, he was completing his secondary education in Nikolayev, a provincial town near Odessa, and his thirst for knowledge was at its youthful height. He was reading voraciously, quote, swallowing, end quote, books on philosophy, quote, striving for a system, end quote. But he resisted Marxism, quote, partly because Marxism seemed a completed system, end quote, and partly because Marxism appeared to him, quote, narrow and dry. On joining a populist circle, Trotsky's attitude became, if anything, even more negative. In one of many similar outbursts of this time, Trotsky declared, quote, a curse upon all Marxists and upon those who want to bring dryness and hardness into all the relations of life, end quote. Footnote. Eastman, citing Eastman, page 67. The outburst was aimed at Alexandra Sokolovskaya, a Marxist within the populist circle who later, 1900, became Trotsky's first wife. End footnote. Trotsky was, for the time being, enticed by the grand ideal of populism and repulsed and bored by what he then took to be the mechanical economic laws of Marxism. But perhaps more than that, although searching for some ideal, Trotsky was unprepared to succumb to a, quote, completed system, end quote, which Trotsky thought would have left nothing to his own initiative and would have demanded of him discipline, loyalty, and an end to personal freedom of belief and action. You know, I should look up Trotsky's wife, just this on Wikipedia. Yet Trotsky was eager to become involved in practical activity, and in the 1890s, populism was already a spent force. In spite of himself, Marxism, in a still very undigested form, was taking a hold of him. Deciding with a friend to write a play in which a Marxist and a populist would be propagandists, he found himself attributing, quote, courage and hope, end quote, to the Marxist, quote, feebleness, end quote, and, quote, failure, end quote, to the populist. Footnote. Or not footnote. Wikipedia says Alexandra Sokolovskaya, who lived from 1872 to 1938, was a Russian Marxist revolutionary and Leon Trotsky's first wife. She perished in the Great Purges no earlier than 1938. Back to the text. Organizing a, quote, university, end quote, for some 20 students, Trotsky took responsibility for the, quote, Department of Sociology, end quote. The year 1897 soon became a turning point. He became convinced that revolutionary work must be carried out amongst the workers, of whom there were about 10,000 in Nikolayev, and together with others organized the South Russian Workers' Union, for which Trotsky also drafted a constitution, quote, along social democratic lines, end quote. But in January 1898, the organization was raided by the police, and Trotsky, together with some 200 others, was arrested. So for 2 years, Trotsky awaited trial, first in Nikolayev, then in Odessa prison. He used the time to become better versed in Marxism. His knowledge of it was still rudimentary, based more on hearsay than actual acquaintance with texts. He read essays by the Italian Marxist Antonio Labriola, and although his, quote, ignorance, end quote, prevented him from understanding fully what he read, after that, quote, all the Russian proponents of the multiplicity of factors, Lavrov, Nikolovsky, Karayev, and others, seemed utterly ineffectual, end quote, to Trotsky. Trotsky became interested in Freemasonry and decided to write a treatise on it using his newly acquired and still elementary notion of, quote, historical materialism, end quote. Quote, I made no new discoveries. All the methodological conclusions at which I had arrived had been made long ago and were being applied in practice, but I groped my way to them, and somewhat independently. I think this influenced the whole course of my subsequent intellectual development. In the writings of Marx, Engels, Plekhanov, and Mehring, I later found confirmation for what in prison seemed to me only a guess, needing verification, for what in prison seemed to me only a guess needing verification and theoretical justification. I did not absorb historical materialism at once, dogmatically. The dialectical method revealed itself to me for the first time not as abstract definitions, but as a living spring which I had found in the historical process as I tried to understand it. End quote. Footnote. The work on Freemasonry was later lost. By the end of 1899, the verdict against Trotsky was announced, and he was sentenced to 4 years of exile in Siberia. Trotsky was first moved to a transfer prison in Moscow. There, for the first time, he heard of Lenin and read, quote, from cover to cover, end quote, Lenin's The Development of Capitalism in Russia, which had just appeared. In the autumn of 1900, Trotsky arrived in the East Siberian village of Ustkut, the place of his banishment. The harsh surroundings, however, did not detract him from pursuing his self-education. He continued his reading, studying Marx and others, and as he read, his conversion became complete. Quote, at the time of my exile, Marxism had definitely become the basis of my philosophy, end quote. Trotsky. However, quote, now it was no longer a question of pure scientific study, but of the choice of a political path, end quote. Trotsky. Hey everyone, I'm reading outside now, so you might hear wind, you might hear people talking, but that's just how it is. I'm not going inside, it's a nice day. Trotsky also began writing and publishing mainly essays on literary and social subjects, analyzing the work of Russian classic authors and of Ibsen, Nietzsche, Hauptmann, and others. He dwelt on one principal theme, the relations between individuals and society, the individual and society. Quote, I sat up night after night scratching up my manuscripts. As I tried to find the exact idea, the right words to express it, I was becoming a writer, end quote. Trotsky. Through these writings, Trotsky was also becoming known to social democrats elsewhere. Trotsky's one purely political work during exile was an essay on party organization in which he argued for a centralized framework with a strong leadership. This was widely circulated in mimeographed form and became the source of a lively controversy among the Social Democrats in Siberia. 2 years later, Trotsky would repudiate the apparent views this essay expressed, but meanwhile, shortly after he wrote it, he received a copy of Lenin's What Is to Be Done, which of course could only strengthen his convictions on this matter. Trotsky had as yet not recognized the full meaning of Lenin's ideas. With the arrival of news and publications from abroad, as Trotsky's own intellectual development progressed, Trotsky became more and more frustrated by his isolation from any kind of real activity. Trotsky yearned to break out of his provincial, barren milieu and plunge into the center of revolutionary circles, whether in Russia or in Europe. Consequently, in the summer of 1902, Trotsky decided to escape his confinement. This proved easier than he had expected, and he soon reached Samara, where he established contact with the Iskra organization. Then, in the autumn, he decided to leave for abroad. After brief stopovers in Vienna and Zurich, he arrived in October in London. In London, Lenin was waiting for Trotsky. Trotsky's published essays had earned Trotsky the reputation of a vivid, imaginative mind, and Lenin was eager to meet this new convert to the revolutionary movement. Lenin was not disappointed, and the two immediately developed mutual respect for each other. But the relationship between them, although generally a warm one, was mainly governed by intellectual and political interests. Trotsky developed closer friendships with some of the other members of the Iskra editorial board, Taras Sasulich and Paul Axelrod in particular. With Plekhanov there was conflict from the outset, apparently growing out of the latter's disdain for the younger Trotsky's intellectual flourish and impudence. But Plekhanov also feared that Lenin courted Trotsky in order to build up a majority against Plekhanov. When Lenin proposed that Trotsky be co-opted to the Iskra board, it was Plekhanov's opposition which prevented his election. This did not stop Trotsky from pursuing active work. Trotsky lectured, traveled to meet Russian revolutionary émigrés in France, Switzerland, Belgium, and Germany, and contributed regularly to the Iskra newspaper. I missed a footnote here, but it says, it was at this time that he acquired the name Trotsky, quote, borrowing, end quote, the name Trotsky from a jailer he had come to know earlier while in prison in Odessa. End footnote. On political questions, there seemed to be general agreement between Lenin and Trotsky. Thus, when in 1903, at the famous Second Congress of the Russian Social Democrats, the two split irrevocably, it came as if without warning, but it was no less tempestuous for that. For reasons which will be discussed later in this study, Trotsky now rejected all talk of a centralized party, and it was Trotsky who now appeared as one of Lenin's main opponents. At the Congress itself, he lashed out at Lenin's, quote, dictatorial, end quote, views, and later Trotsky did the same in a report on the proceedings which Trotsky composed in his official capacity as the delegate of the Siberian Social Democratic Workers' Union. Footnote. This report is the previously mentioned something in Russian. I can't read it. A year later, Trotsky returned to the same subject in a long pamphlet. This constituted an attack which was, if anything, even more scathing, throwing doubt both on the motives of Lenin personally and on the true meaning of the latter's declared views. Footnote. This too is discussed in Chapter 5 below. Trotsky used the initial N for this and the previous work. End footnote. It was the end of a brief partnership which would not be renewed until the fateful days of some 14 years later. For Trotsky, the Congress also marked the beginning of his isolation. Trotsky had opposed Lenin and the emerging Bolshevism, but Trotsky had not become a Menshevik. Footnote. However, Trotsky retained ties with individual Mensheviks and continued writing in Menshevik newspapers. End footnote. Although in subsequent years Trotsky would retain closer relations with the Menshevik faction than with the Bolshevik faction, Trotsky felt at home in neither camp. Trotsky was now without a, quote, roof, end quote, cut off by his own choice from all organizational ties, a revolutionary without a revolutionary base. This was to be the source both of his intellectual strength and his political weakness. Swig of coffee here. Should probably drink water because I just urinated and it was very dark. You know, if I felt comfortable saying that, I should probably drink some water, you know? Trotsky's relatively brief but intensive, quote, odyssey from a provincial populist circle to the center of the Russian social democratic movement, from Nikolayev to Brussels and London, had thus ended in frustration. In search of a base for political activity, Trotsky reached it only to find himself rejecting it. Moreover, although Trotsky had in the course of that, quote, odyssey, end quote, acquired a, quote, system, end quote, of thought, Trotsky himself had only begun to contribute to it. Trotsky had revealed a flourish for ideas and a powerful, though sometimes overly florid, style of expressing them. Footnote. The first to criticize Trotsky's style as florid had been Plekhanov, who used this as an argument against Trotsky's association with Iskra. Lenin, in a letter to Plekhanov, agreed but believed Trotsky would, quote, outgrow, end quote, it. Trotsky himself was very sensitive to any criticism of his style and accepted corrections sulkily. End footnote. There was passion and intelligence in what Trotsky wrote and a clear conception of the issues involved, but his writings did not yet fulfill his overall capacity for sustained theoretical reasoning. And the political subjects with which Trotsky had dealt were chosen more for their topicality than out of personal interest. Trotsky had written about questions of party organization because these were the issue of the day, not because Trotsky considered them generally paramount. And although in doing so Trotsky had recognized their importance and grasped the dangers involved in certain attitudes to them, the matter itself seemed to him, from the point of view of his own intellectual evolution, peripheral. Broader issues involving the problem of the Marxist theory of revolution and Russian social developments were beginning to occupy his attention. As was to occur throughout his life, political isolation was an opportunity for thought and reflection, for, quote, systematic work, end quote, in the realm of ideas. Footnote. In this connection, see the remarks at the beginning of chapter 12. There's some guy just snapping to himself. He's having the time of his life. Rhythmic snapping. Maybe I should take up that hobby. Anyway, back to the text. It was in this mood that in the spring of 1904 in Munich, Trotsky met Alexander Helphand, better known by his pen name Parvis, a Russian Jew who had left his native country in 1887 and settled in Germany. Parvis was to have one of the most checkered and mysterious careers in the annals of social democracy. Footnote. For a full account of Parvis's life, see the biography by Z.A.B. Zeman and W.B. Scharlau, The Merchant of Revolution, published 1965. See also Heinz Scheurer, Alexander Helphand Parvis, Russian revolutionary and German patriot, in The Russian Review. On the influence of Parvis, see W.B. Scharlau, Parvis and Trotsky. End footnote. But at this time, Parvis was considered one of the most original thinkers in the movement, admired and consulted by all, including Lenin. Although he had more or less severed his ties with Russia and become involved primarily in the German revolutionary movement, his home in Munich was often frequented by Russian exiles. Here Trotsky, together with Trotsky's wife, footnote, his second wife, Natalia Sedova, Trotsky's first wife, who had been banished with him, remained behind when he escaped from Siberia. End footnote. Here in Munich, together with his wife, Natalia Sedova, Trotsky came to stay. The result was a, quote, intellectual partnership, end quote, out of which grew the initial sources of Trotsky's theoretical conception of the Russian Revolution. Footnote. Intellectual partnership is the title of the chapter Deutscher devotes to the Trotsky-Parvis relationship in The Prophet Armed. Later in his autobiography, Trotsky acknowledged his debt. Quote, he, Parvis, possessed of wide vision, ... brought me closer to the problems of the social revolution, and for me, definitely transformed the conquest of power by the proletariat from an astronomical, quote, final, end quote, goal to a practical task for our own day, end quote. Trotsky. A bitter opponent of, quote, revisionism, end quote, Parvis in his pre-1904 writings had argued that the workers' movement must continuously agitate for revolution rather than wait for propitious conditions to develop of themselves. In his articles of the 1890s on Russia, Trotsky had clearly aligned himself on the side of those who held that Russian capitalism, however rudimentary, was now a permanent, irreversible phenomenon. Moreover, Trotsky had made a point of emphasizing the weakness... I gotta reread some things. I'm talking about Parvis, and I said Trotsky. A bitter opponent of, quote, revisionism, Parvis, in his pre-1904 writings, had argued that the workers' movement must continuously agitate for revolution rather than wait for propitious conditions to develop of themselves. In Parvis's articles of the 1890s on Russia, Parvis had clearly aligned himself on the side of those who held that Russian capitalism, however rudimentary, was now a permanent, irreversible phenomenon. Moreover, Parvis had made a point of emphasizing the weakness of the Russian bourgeoisie and the consequent strategic importance of the working class. Footnote. In 1940, in an appendix to his Stalin, Trotsky wrote, quote, there is no doubt that Parvis exerted considerable influence on my personal development, especially with respect to the social revolutionary understanding of our epoch, end quote. Trotsky, end footnote. Like others, Trotsky had read and been impressed both by the force of the arguments in these articles and the, quote, virile, muscular, end quote, style in which they had been presented. But the real impact on Trotsky came from a series of articles titled War and Revolution, which Parvis published in Iskra during 1904. Footnote. These were later reprinted in Parvis's book. End footnote. They were accompanied by the outbreak of hostilities between Russia and Japan and opened with a sentence which immediately declared the ominous conclusion to which their arguments were devoted, quote, the Russo-Japanese Wars, the blood-red dawn of coming great events, end quote. Parvis. Parvis's analysis in these articles centered on what he considered to be two new phenomena which now provided the key to further revolutionary developments. The phenomenon of war between capitalist nation-states and the phenomenon of Russia's direct involvement in world capitalist conflicts. Parvis was thus among the first to propose the, quote, imperialist war, end quote, thesis, which was to become so popular in Marxist circles some 10 years later. Parvis argued that the world capitalist order, far from being a unified camp with one common interest, was in fact divided within itself and against itself through the growth of the nation-state. Once the basis of European stability, the nation-state was now a fetter upon further economic development. Competition for overseas markets, rival national economic interests, the insatiable need for continuous industrial expansion, all of these were driving the European powers into what would eventually become a worldwide conflict. As for Russia, her involvement in this lethal confrontation grew both out of Russia's own capitalist ambitions and the particular instability of Russia's social structure. On the one hand, Russia was obliged to fight over Russia's interests abroad in order to remain an independent power. On the other, war was a way of diverting attention from domestic problems, of relieving or delaying pressure for internal social change. In fact, however, since Russia's external aspirations outran Russia's internal capacities, the opposite would occur. War would upset the delicate internal balance, expose the obsolescence of the czarist autocracy, and accelerate the process of social disintegration. Thus, both international developments and her own precarious condition, obviously much more fragile than that of the European powers, would make her particularly vulnerable to a sudden upheaval. Moreover, once this upheaval came, it would not just be a Russian affair, its repercussions would be worldwide. Quote, "The world process of capitalist development brings about a political upheaval in Russia. In turn, this political upheaval will affect political development in all capitalist countries. The Russian Revolution will shake the capitalist world, and the Russian proletariat will assume the role of the vanguard of the social revolution." End quote. Parvis. This view of things later came to be known as the, quote, weakest link, end quote, thesis. The capitalist, quote, chain, end quote, breaking first at its most vulnerable point, namely Russia. Parvis's prophetic conclusion, however, went far beyond anything anyone at the time was prepared to contemplate. Although the idea of Russia as the paradoxical spearhead of revolution had originally been suggested by Marx, though in a different context, and more recently repeated by Karl Kautsky, no one took it very seriously, certainly not the Russian Marxists themselves, who, in accordance with their view of things, could not foresee anything more than a localized bourgeois revolution. Footnote. Oh, never mind, no footnote. The impact of the conclusion on Trotsky, however, was profound. The very sweep of the arguments, the imaginative leap over a conventional determinism, the intellectual courage of stating a paradox, all these found a response in Trotsky's own unorthodox nature. Above all, it appealed to his universal orientations. It offered the possibility of breaking out of a Russian self-centeredness and relating, even linking, the Russian revolutionary movement to the whole gamut of world developments. He himself was now engrossed in the writing of a brochure which would argue how hopeless was the prospect of a bourgeois-led revolution in Russia, and as he completed it, events themselves seemed to be vindicating both his and Parvis's newfound insights. Footnote. Trotsky completed writing the brochure in December 1904, but when Trotsky submitted the brochure for publication to the Mensheviks, the brochure was at first turned down. The brochure was finally published in the above edition in March 1905, with the presently to be discussed preface by Parvis. Later it was reprinted in Trotsky, something in Russian. It is discussed in Chapter 2 below. End footnote. It says on 9/22, January 1905, workers in Saint Petersburg, led by Father Gapon, marched in procession to the Tsar's winter palace. Before the day was over, hundreds lay dead and wounded, victims of salvos fired by the Tsar's troops, and Russia was on the brink of eruption. Trotsky, at the time in Geneva, decided to return to Russia immediately. On the way, he stopped in Munich to see Parvis and show Parvis the manuscript of his brochure. In it, Trotsky had written that the main revolutionary weapon in Russia would become the general strike of workers. Reading this, Parvis was impressed. Quote, "The events," end quote, Parvis told Trotsky, quote, "have fully confirmed this analysis," end quote. And Parvis added that, quote, "now revolution in Russia may place a democratic workers' government in power," end quote. Parvis. Parvis and Trotsky spent several days discussing both events in theory, and Parvis agreed to write a preface to Trotsky's brochure. This preface, Trotsky was later to say, quote, entered permanently into the history of the Russian Revolution, end quote. Trotsky in his Stalin. In it, Parvis was primarily concerned to show how powerful a force the Russian proletariat had become, and how all other opposition forces, including the peasants and the bourgeoisie, were dependent on it in any struggle with the autocracy. This, in his view, was due to the peculiar manner in which classes had developed in Russia. The bourgeoisie had not grown out of towns. Instead, a capitalist class was superimposed from above without the intermediate link of a radical middle class in the provinces. This was responsible for the subsequent weakness of the bourgeoisie, namely, the bourgeoisie's suspension from the air with no roots in the economic development of the country. One of the consequences of this was that the peasantry was unable to develop economically. In the absence both of a manufacturing industry and of bourgeois leadership, the peasants continued to pursue an undifferentiated agricultural economy, or at most, rudimentary production in arts and crafts. The peasants remained an inchoate, disorganized mass, ruled over by a bureaucracy resembling the Chinese model. Although restive and deprived, they of themselves could not spearhead a revolutionary drive. There thus remained only the proletariat, which alone had had a social development of a revolutionary character. It too did not come into being via the economic evolution of the towns and the countryside. There had been none, but had been created by the industrial needs of the state. Thus, rapidly mobilized from amongst peasants seeking employment and suddenly concentrated in large industrial centers, the workers filled a political vacuum, linking village with city and constituting an intermediate element between the weak middle class and the powerful state. Their presence was now, quote, telescoping, end quote, events, since they were a directly involved party in the struggle of the bourgeoisie, unlike in the West, where this struggle was largely independent. In Russia, it could succeed only by mobilizing the workers. In effect, however, this mobilization would not be the work of the bourgeoisie. The proletariat itself would plunge into the struggle of its own accord, dragging the bourgeoisie after it. The result would not be a simple restaging of the, quote, bourgeois revolution, end quote, but a phenomenon completely unique in history, a workers' government in a pre-democratic society. Parvis believed that this would happen, whatever the program and position of the social democratic movement, for the whole basis of Parvis's argument was the spontaneous mass nature of the development. The events of 1905 demonstrated to him how far Russian social democracy was lagging after events. It was the mass of workers themselves who were radicalizing the revolution. Whatever the hesitations of its leadership, the workers would stamp their own definitions on the revolutionary government. Quote, the social democracy will stand before a dilemma, either to take responsibility for the actions of the provisional government or to step aside from the working class movement. The workers will look to the provisional government as their own, no matter what the social democracy does, end quote. Parvis. The manner in which the Marxist movement resolves this dilemma will seal its fate. Quote, the provisional government will be a government of the working class democracy. If the social democracy stands at the head of the revolutionary movement of the Russian proletariat, that government will become a social democratic one. If not, the social democracy will degenerate into an insignificant sect, end quote. Parvis. In view of this, Parvis urged the movement to be in step with the times, to throw overboard all its political caution and theoretical doubts, to make itself the spokesman for the new revolutionary fervor of the workers. With an eye on the, quote, revisionist, end quote, trend of social democracy in Germany, he proposed clear tactical lines for radical action, which would guard the independence of the movement and prevent its appeasement by temporary peasant and bourgeois allies. But his bold, far-reaching conclusions stopped short of the most far-reaching conclusion of all. He did not believe at the end of all this could be a truly socialist revolution. Quote, a social democratic provisional government will not be capable of accomplishing in Russia a socialist revolution, but the mere fact of the liquidation of the autocracy and of the establishment of a democratic republic will create fertile ground for the political activity of social democracy." End quote. Parvis. This somewhat left matters in the air. It implied that the workers' government would be much confined in its scope. It would be more radical, certainly, than a bourgeois regime, but less radical than a socialist regime. And what would be the connection between the democratic innovations and socialist ones, and how could one move from the one to the other? Parvis sensed the element of momentum and transition, but did not work out its connecting links or the process as a whole, nor the actual relationship of all this to political developments elsewhere. Perhaps this was because, although he had provided the outlines of a social analysis of Russia's economic development, Parvis had not explained the compatibility of Russia's persistent backwardness with socialist institutions, the political strength, in other words, of the workers, due to Russia's peculiar social structure, did not in itself argue for the appropriateness of a workers' government. If this latter term was to be understood in its Marxist sense. Even as it stood, however, Parvis's scenario was too much for his Russian colleagues. The Mensheviks' reaction to the idea of an immediate workers' government was predictable, but Lenin too was incredulous. It seemed to Lenin an illusion, generated by imaginative impulse, rather than a realistic appreciation of the alignment of forces in Russia. Quote, "This cannot be," end quote, Lenin wrote in the debate which ensued. Quote, "This cannot be because only a revolutionary dictatorship, supported by a colossal majority of the people, can be at all lasting, ... In trying to aim at an immediate socialist overturn, social democracy would only disgrace itself." End quote, Lenin. That's from a quotation in Solomon Schwartz, The Russian Revolution of 1905. Let me get some water again. I don't know, man. Like, there's like a whole bunch of open space around here. You know. A whole bunch. It's not you know, tight quarters or anything, or I'm hogging up valuable real estate, but this boza came up and just started like talking on his phone right in my fucking ear. I don't know why. I don't know. I mean, I don't have any more claim to be where I am than he does, but like, come on, I'm here first. Can't you just like, you know, go to where there's not someone already talking? And aren't I annoying you? Maybe I was, because he is now gone and I am still here, so perhaps I was annoying him. Or he ended his phone conversation, but fucking weirdo. In fact, the only one who seems to have taken Parvis's preface to Trotsky's brochure seriously was Trotsky himself. In this brochure, Trotsky had concentrated on the unique features of what was taking place in Russian society. True, Trotsky had not been as bold as Parvis, yet the impact of Parvis's ideas on Trotsky was soon to be unmistakable. Henceforth, we would always see this as a turning point in his intellectual development. It was the kind of imaginative prod which Trotsky's mind needed to free itself from the worst confines of the, quote, completed system, end quote, of thought Trotsky had embraced only a few years before. In the said preface, Parvis had written that, quote, "Events are revolutionizing the mind, ... Revolution is driving political thought forward," end quote. Parvis. Neither Parvis nor Trotsky had yet resolved the full implications of what still seemed to be only a bold hypothesis. But as Trotsky now hurried to be at the center of those, quote, events, end quote, in Russia, Trotsky's mind was working feverishly. Forced in the summer of 1905 to go temporarily into hiding in Finland after a brief stay in Russia and before returning again in October, Trotsky had a, quote, short interval of peace, end quote. Quote, I did intensive literary work and took short walks in the country. I read the papers with avidity, watched the parties take shape, clipped newspapers and grouped and sifted facts. During that period, I finally formulated my conception of the inner forces of Russian society and of the prospects of the Russian Revolution. End quote. Trotsky. A quarter of a century later, looking back upon the year 1905 and its impact on his life, Trotsky wrote in his autobiography, quote, the revolution of 1905 made a break in the life of the country, in the life of the party, and in my own life. The break was in the direction of greater maturity, end quote. Trotsky. This joining of the personal and the historical, of Trotsky's own development with that of events, especially revolutionary events, may already tell us something about Trotsky's unabashed sense of identification with the course of history. A subject we will discuss later in this study. Footnote, see chapter 12. But it also reveals the extent to which the events of 1905 aroused and provoked Trotsky's intellectual capacities and shaped Trotsky's subsequent political outlook. Thus, in a remarkable passage again in his autobiography, Trotsky observed, quote, no great work is possible without intuition, that is, without the subconscious sense which, although it may be developed and enriched by theoretical and practical work, must be ingrained in the very nature of the individual. Neither theoretical education or practical routine can replace the political insight which enables one to apprehend a situation, weigh a situation as a whole, and foresee the future. This gift takes on decisive importance at a time of abrupt changes and breaks, the conditions of revolution. The events of 1905 revealed in me, I believe, this revolutionary intuition and enabled me to rely on this revolutionary intuition's assured support during my later life, end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky could hardly wait to give immediate expression in writing to the fruits of this, quote, intuition, end quote. From the middle of October 1905, when Trotsky returned to Russia, until some 6 weeks later, Trotsky would, as is well known, reach an early zenith in his revolutionary career as one of the outstanding leaders of the Saint Petersburg Soviet. But the 15 months between December 1905, when Trotsky would be arrested along with other members of the Soviet, and February 1907, when he would escape, again from exile in Siberia, would be one of the most productive intellectual periods in his life. It was during this period of confinement that Trotsky wrote Results and Prospects, most of the essays of Our Revolution, and the main parts of 1905. For all intents and purposes, the ideas he then developed represented an already completed, rather than tentative theory of revolution, with which his name was henceforth to be linked, and in subsequent years he found it necessary only to refine his theory. The year of 1905 was thus a landmark in his life, both as a revolutionary and as a thinker, for it was in the wake of the events of that year, and with the influence of Parvis still fresh, that he formulated, as he would write, quote, the most finished statement in proof of the theory of permanent revolution, end quote. There's a footnote I missed. References to these works will be given in the following chapter. While in prison, Trotsky also began to write a, quote, big work, end quote, on the theory of rent, but Trotsky later lost the manuscript. End footnote. What happened in 1905 to jar Trotsky's imagination and to set him on a course which he was to pursue throughout the rest of his life? In part, the general answer to this question is contained in a few lines from his dramatic speech to the Tsar's court, trying Trotsky and Trotsky's fellow members of the Soviet. The speech was delivered on 4/17th of October 1906 and came in answer to the official charge that the accused had conspired to prepare an armed uprising against the state. In rejecting this charge in the manner the charge was formulated, Trotsky sought to impart to the court a lesson in the workings of history. Quote, "The uprising of the masses, messieurs judges, is not something which is made. The uprising of the masses occurs of its own accord. The uprising of the masses is the result of social relations and not the product of a plan. The uprising of the masses cannot be manufactured. The uprising of the masses can only be foreseen through the operation of causes which depend as little on us as those causes do on the imperial government. An open conflict had become inescapable. Each day brought us closer and closer to open conflict. ... We note, Monsieur Judges, never prepared an uprising, as the prosecution thinks and says. We prepared for an uprising," end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. For bibliographical information concerning the book 1905, see Chapter 2. End footnote. From this and other observations Trotsky was to make on what happened in 1905, it is clear that the main impression of that year on Trotsky was the sheer spontaneity of the events. Trotsky was in particular impressed by the fact, as Trotsky took it to be, that the revolutionary fervor of the masses, to which lip service had been paid by Marxism so often in the past, was neither a myth nor an illusion but a living reality. Similarly, Trotsky was now struck by, on the one hand, the seeming inscrutability of history and, on the other, the possibility of unraveling its logic. The determinist element in this he had of course inherited and assimilated as every Marxist had done before him. But, if in the past Trotsky had understood it formally, Trotsky now believed himself to have witnessed its reality. Trotsky had, in short, become fascinated by the phenomenon, which to him at least now seemed beyond doubt. The political developments are directly related to social and economic substrata, and that their nature is to be sought, end quote, foreseen, end quote, in social history. Finally, 1905 reaffirmed Trotsky's view, expressed so firmly against Lenin in 1903, that political leadership and organization were to be grasped as instrumental aids, not as substitutes for, nor as the sources of, a mass movement. Curiously, however, the very same determinist element which Trotsky now embraced led Trotsky to think in what to others at least seemed to be grossly non-determinist terms. The logic which Trotsky claimed to perceive in history, at first intuitively but almost immediately afterwards through a long theoretical analysis, was neither the universal logic attributed to Marx nor the inexorable development of a Russian capitalism which Trotsky's co-Marxists were projecting into Russia's future. The logic which Trotsky claimed to perceive in history was rather, Trotsky believed, the logic of very peculiar conditions, making for unique rather than universal circumstances, and subject to the impact of a particular period in world history. The basic elements in Russia's impending future, as in that of all societies, would be the same as in that European past which Marx had described, but the pattern of their development in Russia would be different. If to foresee means not only to assimilate the works of history, but to transcend If to foresee means not only to assimilate the ways of history, but to transcend the ways of history as well, then mind, Trotsky seemed to believe, if it freed itself from the confines of functioning within the framework of hitherto experienced historical patterns alone, could also anticipate reality. The end. Thanks for listening.